Of all the things that I expected to say this week, Venezuela has deployed 4.5 million militiamen in response to American threats is definitely not one of them. Yes, my friends, the Venezuelan government on Monday, and at the time that I'm making this here now, it is Friday, August 22nd, would go and mobilize more than 4 million militia troops, seemingly in response to reports of U.S. naval movements in the region. As Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro would say in a televised address on Monday, August 19th, quote, "We defend our seas, our skies, and our lands. We liberated them. We guard and patrol them. No empire will touch the sacred soil of Venezuela, nor should it touch the sacred soil of South America," end quote. So, yeah, that's something. Now, are there American vessels in the area? It does seem so. Last week, the US government would confirm to CNN that it had ordered naval movements in the region to contain the threat from drug trafficking groups. And on Monday, Reuters would report that 3 US Navy destroyers and some 4,000 military personnel were going to arrive at the edge of Venezuela's territorial waters within the next 36 hours. That US official, who was speaking on the condition of anonymity, would say the additional commitment of military assets in the broader region would include several P-8 spy planes, warships, and at least 1 attack submarine. Reuters would go on to add, quote, "The official said the process would be ongoing for several months, and the plan was for them to operate in international airspace and international waters," end quote. Now, for clarification of what it is that I'm talking about here, the P-8 is a maritime patrol aircraft, not primarily a spy plane alone, but it is capable of a number of different surveillance tasks, which is very useful when you are trying to specifically track down small drug cartel boats. Like, that is a very crucial thing. However, all that being said, on Tuesday, a U.S. Department of Defense official would say that there were currently no U.S. ships in the area, nor have any ships received orders to head there. But then at the same time that I say that, the White House press secretary, Carolyn Leavitt, was then asked Tuesday about a possible troop deployment to Venezuela following reports of the military buildup, and she said, and I quote, "President Trump has been very clear and consistent. He's prepared to use every element of American power to stop drugs from flooding into our country and to bring those responsible to justice," end quote. Which is a pretty specific and blatant statement. Open-ended, yes, but it definitely implies that something is there. She would also reiterate the US government's position that Maduro is, quote, "not a legitimate president," end quote. In response to this, the Venezuelan government would reject Washington's accusation of drug trafficking, saying in a statement that the US was resorting to threats and defamation. So again, yeah, it's getting a little bit spicy. Or should I say, at that point here, it's getting spicier than it has been in a while. After all, Washington and Caracas have not had formal bilateral diplomatic relations since 2019. But going back that far would simply not be enough to tell the full story of what exactly is happening here. For those that are curious, I did a couple of full videos on Venezuela, its economic and political crises that developed under Chavez, and how things have not been improving and has even worsened during the presidency of successor Nicolas Maduro. His rule has been something that has been marked by hyperinflation, escalating starvation, disease, crime, escalating mortality rates, all resulting in massive emigration as millions of people have fled the country. In fact, even now as I go and say this, I would genuinely be surprised if within the next decade there even are 4+ million militia that could be called upon at the rate that things are going. Which is wild, because it wasn't all that long ago that Venezuela, which possesses the world's largest crude oil reserves, was a relatively stable democracy with one of Latin America's fastest rising economies. This was a nation that was so rich in petroleum revenue that the socialist government of the former late president Hugo Chavez would spend stupid amounts on social programs, and at one point was even providing free heating oil for impoverished Americans in the United States, which for some of you, that may come as a surprise, but yeah, that happened. And it was a huge PR move for Chavez's government. For clarification of what I'm talking about here, in the early to mid-2000s, Venezuela's heating oil program would provide a one-time heating oil delivery of 100 gallons to low-income Americans and would donate 45 million gallons, or more than $100 million worth of heating oil, to more than 200,000 families in 23 states in 2007 alone, and that was the 3rd year that they had actually done it, which is genuinely impressive. But starting in 2014, the South American nation began to suffer a massive and very rapid collapse, with Venezuela's gross domestic product plummeting even more than the United States had during the Great Depression. Many of its nearly 32 million inhabitants became unable to afford basic food, and resource-starved hospitals didn't have even soap or antibiotics in order to be able to treat people. Meanwhile, as the economy was crashing and burning, Venezuela's political system would spiral into turmoil. President Nicolas Maduro, whose 2018 re-election was tainted by accusations of irregularities and voter intimidation, would face massive street protests and even survived a spring 2019 military uprising that was instigated by opposition politician Juan Guaido, who is the leader of the elected National Assembly, whose legislative powers were taken away by Maduro's regime in 2017. It was chaos, and the resulting crisis would go and drive millions of people to flee from Venezuela in search of food, better living conditions, work opportunities, and more. It's gotten to the point that now, at the time that I'm recording this, in the year 2025, almost 8 million people have fled the country. And that number, at the time that we're talking about this, is really only set to grow. Not at the same pace that it was back in the 2010s, but it's still happening. But then, my friends, in order to be able to go and explain that and the current tensions between the two countries, we are going to need to go and take a step back and explore some context. And oh boy, is there a lot. You can probably already see from the length of this video that we are going to be talking about quite a number of things here, so I want you to be prepared. And to my editor who is having to do this, Dakota, I am sorry, please don't cry. I promise that you will get extra rations here. As long as you can identify Northern Ireland from the rest of Ireland. That is all. Anyway, my friends, in order to explain this story, because we have already kind of done it before in a previous video, I'm not going to go all the way back to the beginning of Venezuela's colonial history in detail. We are instead going to have to do a bit of a speed run through this while also providing more details about what was happening with the relationship between the United States and Venezuela and why it got so bad. So yeah, here we go. But look, my friends, before we go any further, I need to say something right now. No, the United States is not just going to war with Venezuela. No matter what it is that you are seeing from certain content creators, either here on YouTube or you are seeing on TikTok or you are seeing from news articles, because oh dear God, the sheer amount of just straight up fear-mongering that I have seen is absolutely insane. And really, when we talk about that, it's one of the key problems with modern news. It's not actually about telling the truth. It's about telling a specific kind of story from a specific bias. And that is one of the key intrinsic issues that we see in today's day and age. Which is why, personally, I'm really glad to be sponsored by Ground News. They've been a longtime sponsor of this channel, and they're one of the key resources that I use in order to be able to tell you all these stories in the first place. Because, again, I'm saying this. I'm not perfect. I am absolutely not, but I do at least make an effort in order to be able to try and remove my biases as much as possible before explaining something to you all. I can see who exactly is talking about this, what their bias is in regards to political affiliation, what their factuality rating is, and one of my personal favorite details, who actually owns said media source. Because this is the thing that a lot of people don't even realize when looking at media, is that there is a key difference between when something is done by private journalists versus a government-owned news source. Genuinely, I can't praise Ground News enough. So by all means, if you want to support this channel, and more importantly, you want to support yourself and actually learn things about the world, go to groundnews.com/historyofeverything and get 40% off the Ground News Vantage plan. This is the same plan I use, and if you want to get it for 40% off, go and click my link down in the description. Do not let yourself be ignorant of the world around you, my friends. To begin then, the land that we call Venezuela was first explored by Europeans in 1498, when Alonso de Ojeda and Amerigo Vespucci would go and land on the coast, which I know from the very get-go, I'm going to be seeing comments that say, he said he wasn't going back that far, immediately travels back by 500 years. I know, but we're going to move through it extremely quickly, I promise. The region was later colonized by the Spanish, who established settlements and would exploit the indigenous population for labor and resources, and that's pretty much the way that things would remain. Venezuela was not nearly as valuable as other colonies, being largely agricultural instead of mineral-rich, and so for the most of its history, it was largely left to its own colonial devices. That system would remain in place for the next 300-odd years until eventually the War for Independence would break out in 1811. Following that, on December 17, 1819, the Congress of Angostura would establish Gran Colombia's independence from Spain, and Venezuela was part of said country. After several more years of war, which killed half of Venezuela's white population, the country would achieve independence from Spain in 1821 under the leadership of its most famous individual, Simón Bolívar. Now, this previous part, I literally am required to mention it because one cannot understate just how much of a massive influence Simón Bolívar was and is to large parts of South America. His influence levels there are George Washington levels to America, but like on steroids, with a stupid number of things being named after him, including Venezuela's currency, the Bolivar. And his legacy is constantly being touted by Venezuelan politicians who want to, quote, carry on the revolutionary legacy, end quote. That would include Chavez and Maduro and pretty much anyone who is anyone in the country. But we're going to talk about that more later. Anyway, moving on, the good times do not really last, like at all. Gran Colombia breaks apart almost immediately, and for a century afterwards, Venezuela would come under varying military dictatorships. Oil would be discovered in the country early in the 20th century, and it would greatly help the economy and allowed Venezuela to pay off its foreign debt, which is, a good thing. But while oil certainly benefited the nation in many ways, the wealth was rarely distributed to average citizens. Eventually, though, following decades of rocky leadership by dictators and military juntas, Romulo Betancourt would get elected president in 1958. Known as the father of Venezuelan democracy, Betancourt would oversee the 1963 elections, which would usher in the first democratic civilian-to-civilian transfer of power. Which, hey, when we talk about countries that are newly free, or free of dictatorships, we should say, that is a really big deal. But it's still not perfect. Because for the next 3 decades, Venezuela would ride the boom and bust cycle of global oil prices under civilian democratic rule, which would see rapid development and urbanization of society. To give you an idea of what it is that I am talking about, the quadrupling of crude oil prices in 1973 would spawn a kind of oil euphoria and a spree of public and private consumption that was unprecedented in Venezuelan history. A 5-month OPEC embargo on countries backing Israel in the Yom Kippur War would quadruple oil prices and made Venezuela the country with the highest per capita income in all of Latin America. The government managed to spend more money in absolute terms from 1974 to 1979 than its entire independent history dating all the way back to 1830. That is a lot of spending. Yet, at the same time that I say that, elections were limited to competition between the 2 main political parties through a early 1960s pact known as the Punto Fijismo, and corruption within the government was simply endemic. In fact, analysts would estimate that as much as $100 billion were embezzled between 1972 and 1997 alone within the country. And so from here, the 1980s roll around, the price of oil crashes, and everything goes to crap and crisis. Now, that part with corruption is not really going to get any better, but this is where the first big character of this story and the start of the problems with the United States comes in, Hugo Chavez. Influenced by his 19th century hero, the revolutionary Simón Bolívar, military officer Hugo Chavez would establish the leftist revolutionary Bolivarian movement 200 within the army. The movement would borrow from Bolivar's belief in a unified Latin America, but it also drew much inspiration from the leftist Peruvian military junta of the 1970s. As a teacher at the Military Academy of Venezuela, Chavez would gain a reputation for massive rousing lectures and criticism of the Venezuelan government, which was about to royally piss people off. The government, not Chavez. I should go ahead and clarify that statement. Yes, a lot of things were going down in the 80s. In the latter half of the decade, President Carlos Andrés Pérez would implement free market reforms, the so-called Washington Consensus, in an attempt to solve Venezuela's economic crisis at the urging of the IMF because the country simply was horribly managed. Later that month, Venezuelans would riot against a massive increase in gas prices. Under presidential order, the country's security forces would brutally put down this uprising, which was so bad and so brutal that it became known as the Caracazo, or Caracas Smash, which honestly sounds like a wrestling move, but in this case, it's a lot more than fake wrestling. The government would report 275 people getting killed, but Venezuelan media sources would claim that at least 3,000 people died during the fighting. The riots and subsequent military crackdown would have a severe polarizing effect upon the general population as well as the military, which was not happy with what it had had to do. As a result of the incident, the image of Venezuela as this peaceful, functioning democratic state was completely shattered. Following these events, my friends, 2 separate coups would be attempted by Chavez or his supporters, with the first one failing horribly and landing him in jail, which he would remain in before he was released in 1994. After which, in 1998, he managed to achieve victory in the presidential election and would embark on a new program of what he would call 21st century socialism. This is where things get really complicated. Again, I know I'm skipping through quite a bit here, but I've already kind of explained that part here before, and we have to move through in order to get to what we're trying to talk about. The important thing to note here is that these programs were going to have massive effects, both really good and, as you're going to see here, really bad later. Because over the next decade and a half, Chavez would embark on massive social spending sprees, the so-called Bolivarian missions. All of these meant to bolster public support and rally the people behind him while improving the lives of the everyday citizens. Run by various government bodies and ministries, the missions would provide adult literacy programs, offer free community health care to impoverished communities, construct low-income housing for the poor, and subsidize food and other consumer goods. It would provide public health clinics, with many being run by Cuban doctors, and all these things would win praise from the international organizations that were watching it, including the World Health Organization and the United Nations. It was a really big deal. While some would go and criticize the programs as being very inefficient and corrupt, the Venezuelan government would report significant increases in literacy and massive reductions in poverty levels. Which, yeah, that is true. But also, both things were true. The humanitarian achievements by the regime in the early years were truly awesome, and tens of millions of people were dragged out of poverty. Literacy and healthcare access rates would skyrocket, and the economy really did seem to boom, which sounds amazing. This is why you see certain ideological groups praise Venezuela as a model of socialism done right, only to then later go back and say, oh, it wasn't true socialism when it failed, or that it was all the Americans' fault. Because yes, at the same time that I say all this and all these good things do happen, it was also a horribly corrupt and inefficient system, but it was able to be maintained so long as oil prices stayed high, which gave the government vast reserves of cash to be able to spend. You may see the issue here. Increasingly, the entire state was more and more dependent on oil, and if anything ever happened to it, the entire house of cards was going to come crashing down. But surely that was never going to happen, right? Foreshadowing. Anyway, it's at this point then that the political disputes and international criticism, particularly from the United States, begins to come into play. I just had to explain everything else here in order to be able to set the stage. To explain this, my friends, Chavez's leftist ideology and his commitment to what he called the Bolivarian Revolution were seen as a direct challenge to U.S. influence in the region. Chavez's policies, which included the nationalization of key industries such as oil and the redistribution of wealth, were viewed with suspicion by the U.S. government. Chavez's close ties with Cuba and his support for leftist movements across Latin America would further strain relations, as the U.S. saw these potential alliances as attempts to counter its own hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. The bigger problem, though, was what was happening at home. And when I say at home, I don't mean within the United States, I mean specifically within Venezuela, because that's where things get a little bit suspicious and odd. Because after enacting a new constitution with many human rights protections in 1999 and surviving a short-lived coup d'etat in 2002, Chavez and his followers would gradually move to concentrate power within the party and specifically within him. They seized control of the Supreme Court and undercut the ability of journalists, human rights defenders, and other Venezuelans to exercise fundamental rights. By his second full term in office, the concentration of power and erosion of human rights protections had given the government basically free rein to intimidate, censor, or prosecute Venezuelans who criticized the president or tried to thwart his political agenda. As an example of what I'm talking about, in the year 2004, Chavez and his followers in the National Assembly would carry out a political takeover of Venezuela's Supreme Court, going and adding 12 seats to what had been a 20-seat tribunal, and packing them with government supporters. And when I say government, I mean Chavez supporters. The packed Supreme Court would basically cease to function as any kind of check on presidential power. Its justices would openly reject the principle of separation of powers and instead pledged their commitment to advancing Chavez's political agenda. It was a blatant power grab. You go and combine this with Chavez's anti-American rhetoric and his efforts to create a counterweight to U.S. influence, such as the formation of the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, or ALBA, and all of this is going to further deepen the divide. The U.S. would respond by supporting opposition groups within Venezuela and imposing economic sanctions on specific sectors, including the oil industry because of Venezuela's alleged lack of cooperation with anti-drug and counterterrorism efforts from 2005 to 2006. And that year then, 2006, that is where things begin to pick up speed. See, Chavez would go and win re-election with 63% of the vote, proclaiming, quote, "Nothing can stop the revolution," end quote. Shortly after his victory, he would go and announce that he wanted to create a single political party, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, or PSUV. Chavez would draw the bulk of his support from his own party, the Movement for a Fifth Republic, turning the country into a almost one-party state. Other parties still existed, yes, so it's not accurate to just call it a one-party state, but pretty much all power for anything and everything was concentrated just within the one party, and that's it. Following this, Chavez would kick off 2007 with a new mandate passed by the National Assembly that was almost entirely controlled by his supporters, called the Chavistas, at this point. He replaced most of his cabinet, announced the nationalization of telecom and electricity industries, as well as the central bank, and canceled the broadcast license of private media company RCTV. He also proposed an act that would give him the power to rule by decree, meaning he didn't have to do anything through legislation for 18 months. He could basically rule as his own kind of dictator king. In April of that year, Chavez would announce the nationalization of oil projects in the Orinoco Belt, estimated by the state-owned oil company to have some 236 billion barrels of heavy crude, making it the largest petroleum reserve in the entire world. And with this being the mid to late 2000s, oil prices have Venezuela riding high. They are bringing in massive amounts of cash to support all these different government programs, but not for long. As the petrostate of Venezuela was soon going to discover, there was about to be a very rude, very abrupt wake-up moment that you think that they would have already learned their lesson from after the 1980s, but no, they did not. As I kind of already explained, when Hugo Chavez came to power in 1998, he would go and leverage Venezuela's immense oil reserves and rising crude prices to provide subsidized goods and services to the Venezuelan people, cutting the extreme poverty rate by a whopping 15% in just a couple of years. It was huge. However, years of economic mismanagement and corruption under Chavez would transform the once fairly capable managed state-owned PDVSA oil company into a dysfunctional, corrupt, and bloated institution that was run by military and political allies that were friends of the regime without any real ability or experience as technicians or actual owners. It mattered more that they were politically loyal. Chavez would also go and deepen Venezuela's dependence on oil exports, with fuel as a percentage of total exports rising from around 71% in 1998, which is still really high, but, there's some wiggle room, to close to 98% by 2013, which is ludicrous. That means the entire economy, every single bit of cash that you possibly have to purchase foreign goods, is entirely dependent on one industry. Therefore, the collapse of global oil prices in 2014 led to a rapid economic decline. But, of course, we're not quite there yet. The government first has to get way worse and way more corrupt. You see, in September of 2010, the opposition coalition would break Chavez's majority in the National Assembly election, managing to win 65 seats out of 165. Which, that's of course not a majority in and of itself, but it does break the two-thirds majority that President Hugo Chavez's Socialist Party of Venezuela had held since 2005. That majority had allowed them to push through whatever legislation Chavez ordered. That was no longer going to be the case. Or at least that was what was supposed to happen. However, before the newly elected members could take office, a pro-Chavez assembly would allow him to rule by decree again for 18 months, during which he changed term limits, he redistributed oil revenues, and he redrew congressional districts. The redistricting would go and ensure Chavez's party retained a majority, despite losing the popular vote to the opposition party. Chavez's party had actually slid down the polls in recent months, driven down by high crime rates, food shortages, and record high inflation, which, although bad, was not as bad as it was going to be in a couple years. Still, it wasn't good. Yet, after the results were posted, Chavez would declare on his official Twitter account that the government had obtained a, quote, solid victory sufficient to continue deepening the democratic Bolivarian socialism, end quote, and that was that. He could do everything still, despite cheating. Yep, totally legit. But things are not going to last for Chavez. From 2011 to 2013, Chavez would struggle with cancer, undergoing multiple treatments in Cuba. Ultimately, he was not able to hold on, and despite winning a fourth-term election that he was too sick to even show up to his own inauguration for in January of 2013, that would pretty much be the end of him. The following weeks were beset with uncertainty as protesters demanded clarity on what exactly his condition was. Chavez would return to Caracas on February 18th, and there he would announce via Twitter that he was going to continue his treatment in Venezuela, but it really doesn't matter. Only 2 weeks later, his hand-picked successor, Vice President Nicolas Maduro, would announce on March 5th that Chavez had died. And from this point, In 30 days, new elections were going to take place, and that is where the distrust and spat between the US and Venezuela really escalates drastically. In fact, just to give you an idea of what was going down, in the year 2013, before Chavez had died, Venezuelan Vice President Nicolas Maduro would go and expel 2 US military attachés from the country, saying that they were plotting against Venezuela by attempting to recruit Venezuelan military personnel to destabilize the country. And, that one is actually theoretically possible, that could have been happening, but more importantly, he also seemed to accuse them of causing Chavez's cancer somehow. Like, we don't know the validity of the first one. There is indeed a possibility considering where it is that the US has been involved in things, but causing cancer is a bit less likely. The Obama administration would reject the allegations and respond by expelling 2 Venezuelan diplomats. And that was that, I guess. Also, hey, my friends, since we're talking about things all around the world, if you want to travel with me, I am leading a trip to both Thailand, Greece, and even Japan here. If you want to sign up and go on an adventure with me, check out the link down in my description because we are leading a series of trips, and I cannot wait to be able to travel with all of you. You want to see some ancient sites? You want to meet some friends? Let's go have some fun around the world. Following Chavez's death, a heated presidential campaign would ensue between acting President Nicolas Maduro and opposition leader Enrique Capriles. Early polls would show that Chavez's successor had a double-digit lead, and yeah, these were government polls, so they were going to support him, which seemed pretty likely, but the April 14th election delivered a very surprising narrow victory for Maduro, who managed to just earn 50.6% of the vote to Capriles' 49.1%. That is a 1.5-point difference. A recount was of course demanded by Capriles because this seemed to be something that could have been flawed, but the government-supporting agencies denied a recount. Instead, Maduro would immediately begin to consolidate his power, using authority given to him by the National Assembly to rule by decree. But even with this power, he was not able to halt the decline in oil prices that pulled down the Venezuelan economy with it in 2014. Yes, my friends, now, finally, the house of cards was fully crashing down. As I already explained earlier, oil was a huge percentage of the Venezuelan economy, and at this point in the story, it accounted for around 96% of all of Venezuela's exports. So, when the price of crude would collapse in 2014, the economy took a major hit. According to the IMF, the Venezuelan economy shrank by 30% from 2013 through 2017. Government revenues would plummet along with oil prices, and with fewer US dollars to spend on imports, there was a scarcity of many products. But compared to some earlier issues like in 2003, this impact was way worse. Reliance on food and consumer good imports had drastically increased during the oil price boom. People got used to being able to buy whatever goods they wanted and would import massive amounts of these. Domestic production would decrease rapidly after years of added regulations, whether price controls or other things like that, for example. And because of just how inefficient operations were of nationalized businesses, it meant that production was really low in general, so most people would just import products. It was better quality and generally better prices. Along with all of that, it wasn't just a matter of buying said goods. There was a much greater reliance on the government for distributing said goods and services. Store shelves became bare, and the black market price for many basic items would skyrocket. So, what do you do to fix this? Well, Maduro's government would attempt to address the economic crisis by printing money, which we know works so well every time. This policy would push the country into years-long hyperinflation, which was on pace to hit 10 million% in 2019 and led to a de facto two-currency system in which the US dollar was dominant. As an example of what I'm talking about here, the price of a single cup of coffee measured using Bloomberg's Café con Leche index was more than 2 million bolivars in May of 2018. That is up from 190,000 in April, a single month. And it goes from 190,000 to 2 million. The 3-month annualized inflation rate was over 1.2 million%. That is a level of hyperinflation that has not been seen since Germany in the 1920s or Zimbabwe back in 2008, which again, I'm probably gonna need to do a video on considering what has been going on with trying to bring back the white farmers. Anyway, as Venezuela's situation worsened, the Maduro regime would go and arrest opposition political leaders and shut down news websites and detain journalists, leading to criticism from the UN and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Under the Obama administration, the United States would implement the first sanctions on Venezuela. In December of 2014, the U.S. Congress would pass the Venezuela Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act, which directed President Obama to impose sanctions on Venezuelan security forces who violently repressed student protests. The president would codify the act in 2015 by revoking the assets and visas of 8 individuals in the Maduro administration. That situation would only escalate further in 2017, when President Donald Trump's administration would impose their own series of sanctions on Venezuela, targeting key sectors of the economy, including the oil and financial industries. These sanctions were designed to cut off the Maduro government's access to international financial markets and reduce its ability to export oil, which was still, despite all the issues, the lifeblood of the entire economy. Does Venezuela respond to any of this well? No, it does not. As a result of discontent with the government, in the 2015 parliamentary election, the opposition was elected to the majority in the National Assembly. They actually managed to take it. After which this happened, the outgoing National Assembly, which still consisted of many Bolivarian Chavez supporters, would go and fill the Supreme Tribunal of Justice, the highest court in Venezuela, with Maduro allies in order to completely paralyze it. Along with this, shortly after, Maduro would disavow the National Assembly in 2017, leading to the 2017 Venezuelan constitutional crisis. Protests would grow all across the country, and on the 1st of May 2017, Maduro would call for a constituent assembly that would draft a new constitution to replace the 1999 Venezuela constitution. Here's the thing though, the members of the constituent assembly were not going to be elected in open elections. They were going to be selected from social organizations that were loyal to Maduro. Go figure. It would also then allow him to stay in power during the interregnum and skip the 2018 presidential election, as he could rule basically by decree again. The Democratic Unity Roundtable, the opposition to the incumbent ruling party, would go and boycott the election, and the incumbent Great Patriotic Poll, which was of course dominated by the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, would as a result win almost every single seat in the assembly by default, because there was literally no opposition. This new entity was sworn in on the 4th of August 2017, and the next day would declare itself to be the supreme governmental branch with supreme power in Venezuela, banning the opposition-led National Assembly from performing actions that would interfere with itself. Fast forward a little bit of time, and in February of 2018, Maduro would go and call for presidential elections, this being 4 months before it was actually supposed to happen. And when it does take place, there are many irregularities, including the banning from standing of major opposition parties. Like, they're straight up not allowed to run. Maduro was then subsequently declared the winner in May of 2018, though of course, because of everything that takes place, most people say that the elections are completely invalid. Go figure. The National Assembly would of course declare Maduro's election to be completely illegitimate, and opposition leader Juan Guaido would announce that he was going to assume office as interim president until free and fair elections could be held, in accordance with the succession rules of the 1999 Constitution. Guaido was quickly recognized as interim president by the United States, Canada, most of the European Union, and the Organization of American States. However, Maduro would retain some key support from several major countries, including China, Cuba, Russia, and Turkey, all states that we know so well for their democratic institutions. The resulting political standoff would see an increase in U.S. sanctions against the Maduro government, including targeting oil shipments to Cuba. Maduro had been increasingly relying on Cuban military and intelligence support to stay in power, and at the same time, threats of sanctions on third parties linked to Venezuela's oil sector and discussion of potential military intervention was taking place, which ultimately did not occur. Like, there was a whole discussion that Trump potentially had to go and invade Venezuela, and that did not occur. Russia, meanwhile, continued to support Maduro's government, sending Russian troops to Venezuela in March of 2019 in order to help the government evade sanctions on the oil industry. China would also continue to back the Maduro government, offering to help rebuild the national power grid, which was experiencing constant blackouts. As all of this is going down, amidst the humanitarian crisis that has been developing, thousands were fleeing the country daily by early 2019, mostly on foot, exacerbating Venezuela's economic problems. Its poorly maintained infrastructure led to countrywide blackouts in March 2019 that left millions of people without power. In April of 2019, after years of denying the existence of any kind of humanitarian crisis and refusing to allow foreign aid to enter the country, calling aid shipments a political ploy by the United States, Nicolas Maduro would finally allow the entry of a shipment of emergency supplies from the Red Cross. It wasn't much, but it was something. That all being said, still, the US recognition of Guaido was met with resistance from the Maduro government, which accused the US of attempting a coup d'etat, and all diplomatic relations were fully cut off. Maduro's government has since blamed the US for the economic problems that it has, arguing that sanctions would exacerbate the humanitarian crisis and caused widespread shortages of food, medicine, and other essential goods. The Maduro government would also accuse the US of supporting opposition groups and providing them with resources to destabilize the regime and country. These accusations have actually been one of the key central parts of the entire Maduro government's narrative, which has been used to justify its own authoritarian measures and to rally support from its base. Though, that all being said, when I explain this, it needs to be stressed, as we have already shown over the course of this and why I have spent so long explaining everything in this video, that while yes, the sanctions did make things worse. They absolutely did, as they were designed to. The country was already imploding from its own horrible governance and incompetence. It just made a really bad situation a bit worse. But that all being said, it is here, my friends, that we can finally get into the drug accusations that spawned today's video in the first place. Maduro was indicted in a New York federal court in 2020 during the first Trump presidency. He and 14 others, including several close allies, were hit with federal charges of narco-terrorism and conspiracy with the Colombian FARC insurgent group to import cocaine. Now, I've already done a full video about FARC, and considering developments in Colombia, we are likely going to need to go back and take a look once more. That is a video that's probably going to come out within the next month. But per U.S. Attorney General at the time, William Barr, quote, "For more than 20 years, Maduro and a number of high-ranking colleagues allegedly conspired with the FARC, causing tons of cocaine to enter and devastate American communities." End quote. Furthermore, per U.S. Attorney Geoffrey S. Berman, quote, "The scope and magnitude of the drug trafficking alleged was made possible only because Maduro and others corrupted the institutions of Venezuela and provided political and military protection for the rampant narco-terrorism crimes described in our charges. As alleged, Maduro and other defendants expressly intended to flood the United States with cocaine in order to undermine the health and well-being of our nation. Maduro very deliberately deployed cocaine as a weapon. While Maduro and other cartel members held lofty titles in Venezuela's political and military leadership, the conduct described in the indictment was not statecraft or service to the Venezuelan people. As alleged, the defendants betrayed the Venezuelan people and corrupted Venezuelan institutions in order to line their own pockets with drug money." End quote. And yeah, as for the amount of money that we're talking about here in the first place, per U.S. Attorney Ariana Fajardo Orshan, quote, "Over the last decade, corrupt Venezuelan government officials have systematically looted Venezuela of billions of dollars. Far too often, these corrupt officials and their co-conspirators have used South Florida banks and real estate to conceal and perpetuate their illegal activity. As the recent charges show, Venezuelan corruption and money laundering in South Florida extends to even the highest levels of Venezuelan judicial system. In the last couple of years, the U.S. Attorney's Office in South Florida and its federal law enforcement partners have united to bring dozens of criminal charges against high-level regime officials and co-conspirators, resulting in seizures of approximately $450 million. End quote. So yeah, it is quite a lot. And subsequently, a reward of $15 and then later $25 million were offered for Maduro's arrest by the Trump administration. These, as you can imagine, were very serious charges, and they were denied as just another tool of American imperialism to crush the revolution by the Venezuelans. You would think, potentially, that something big would go down here then, but no, nothing more really happens, because Trump goes and loses the 2020 election, Biden comes to power that next year, and that next year, Maduro begins to consolidate power once again. In January of 2021, Maduro and his allies would take leadership of what was the last opposition-controlled power center in the government, the National Assembly, after claiming victory in legislative elections. The opposition, including Guaido, would boycott the vote, alleging that it was fraudulent, a charge that was reaffirmed by the Joe Biden administration and other foreign governments and international bodies, including Canada, the European Union, and the Organization of American States. However, regional elections that November would further cement Maduro's power and saw the fractured opposition win only 3 of 23 available governorships. After years of waning support, with no real change in sight, the opposition would vote to remove Guaido and dissolve his government in December of 2022. So that ends. And now, you would think at this point that it would all be over. And It sort of was, I guess. Economically, it was really bad now, but it wasn't as bad as it was a few years earlier. In September of 2021, Venezuela had announced the launch of a new currency, dropping 6 zeros from its Bolivar notes, which is a really big deal. While these drastic shifts in economic policy did leave many Venezuelans struggling to secure bolivars and adapt in the short term, hyperinflation would at least go down a bit. The bolivar would manage to stabilize in early 2022, with annualized inflation briefly falling below 50%, though more than 60% of transactions were still carried out in dollars, which were far more valuable and reliable. After falling by 75% since 2014, Venezuela would manage to achieve a 15% growth in 2022, the highest in Latin America. However, that all being said, inflation began to slowly rise again in late 2022, and by 2023, consumer prices were tripling annually. Yeah, technically speaking, it's an improvement from the hyperinflation of several million% that we had seen earlier, but it was still one of the highest inflation rates in the entire world. One of the key reasons that this was able to even happen in the first place is because U.S. Venezuela relations actually kind of improved a little bit during this time. Like, yes, they were still frosty, of course, but they weren't as hostile as they had been. In November of 2022, in part to help offset rising global energy prices due to the war in Ukraine, the United States would permit U.S. oil giant Chevron to resume limited operations in the country. In exchange, the Maduro government and the opposition would agree to continue dialogue following a year-long stalemate. The following October, Caracas would agree to a roadmap for a free and fair presidential election in 2024, and things actually seemed to be moving towards a sense of normalcy. Washington would reward the move by further easing sanctions on Venezuela's oil and gas sector, which allowed it to export more oil and gas products for 6 months, which seemed good. But after the Venezuelan government's failure to meet conditions for a fair vote, including the fact that it went and banned the primary opposition leader from running for office, and the revival of a centuries-old territorial dispute with Guyana over control of the oil-rich Essequibo region, Washington would once again reimpose oil sanctions in April of 2024, and we were right back where we started. Relations only got further strained in the wake of Venezuela's July 2024 presidential election, which would see the Maduro government and opposition party both claim victory. In response, Venezuela's top prosecutor, Tarek William Saab, would announce a criminal investigation against the opposition, claiming that they, and I quote, falsely announced a winner of the presidential election other than the one proclaimed by the National Electoral Council, the only body qualified to do so, end quote. As for other parts of the government, the defense minister, Vladimir Padrino, would reaffirm the military's, and I quote, absolute loyalty, end quote, to Maduro, which you may wonder why. Why would this be still happening? Why would the military support the government after everything that's been going on? Well, since 2020, Maduro had been turning the military, who were already fairly pro-Chavista, even more pro-Chavista. Any elements which were even mildly disloyal or potentially harboring feelings of disloyalty or support for the opposition ended up in jail, while the loyal ones were instead rewarded by the government with higher positions, huge economic bonuses, and political favors. And you know, if political favors and bribes and all these things didn't work, you could always just cheat. Because as electronic results began to pour into Caracas, showing the opposition was actually in the lead in the early stages of the election, the government-controlled Electoral Council suddenly would interrupt transmission for approximately 2 hours. The delay, analysts said, seemed to give the government time to switch to a plan B, so to speak. Because shortly after midnight, the Electoral Council would instead declare that Maduro was the winner, announcing vote totals that don't really seem to have been based on actual ballots recorded by the electoral system. The announcement would subsequently plunge Venezuela into a political crisis that claimed at least 22 lives in violent demonstrations, leading to the jailing of more than 2,000 people and the global community denouncing the country. Which was really bad, but not only did this happen, but simultaneously the government refused to release any vote tallies to stand up Maduro's claim of victory. The government organization behind confirming the winner basically said, hey, trust me, bro. That's it. His re-election was thus rejected by the United States and many other countries in the Americas and Europe, though, of course, that wasn't going to change anything for Maduro, who in turn was going to respond to criticism by doubling down on his repression of opponents and breaking ties with nations that rejected his victory, instead seeking closer ties with entities like Russia and China. After a brief period of what seemed like tensions easing up, this new election had left Maduro with a very tough decision: whether he was going to hold on to power no matter what the cost was, or accept some kind of political compromise that would weaken his grip on the country that he had fought so hard to maintain. Considering everything that we've covered over the course of this video, what kind of choice do you think that he made? Either way, my friends, it is now, finally, that we get to Trump, the new war on cartels, and 2025 developments. When Trump returned to office in January of 2025, he would go and sign an order directing the State Department to start labeling drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Fast forward a little bit of time, and in February, the State Department would designate Tren de Aragua, Mara Salvatrucha, known as MS-13, and several other groups as foreign terrorist organizations, saying that they constituted, quote, a national security threat beyond that posed by traditional organized crime, end quote. Following this, on the 17th of March 2025, the US would deport around 200 alleged Venezuelan gang members, invoking the 1798 Alien Enemies Act, which, yeah, this was a very interesting time when all that was going down, because that's a rare thing, I'll tell you that much. The detainees, accused of ties to Tren de Aragua and MS-13, were sent to El Salvador's mega prison under an agreement with President Nayib Bukele, who, honestly, at this point, I need to do an update video on here, because a lot more things have happened. Either way, this move was part of Trump's aggressive immigration policy, and it greatly angered Venezuela. From here, things would simmer for a while, but nothing major would happen again until July of 2025. This being when the Trump administration would add the Venezuelan Cartel de los Soles, or Cartel of the Suns, to a list of specially designated global terrorist groups, asserting that it wasn't just a cartel, it was one that was headed by President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela and other high-ranking officials in administration, which is a major accusation. A few weeks later, in the beginning of August 2025, the Justice and State Departments would announce that the US government was doubling the reward, that $25 million reward on Maduro, to $50 million for information that could lead to his arrest. This being because, again, as I talked about earlier, he'd been indicted on drug trafficking charges. The administration again described him as a cartel head, and Attorney General Pam Bondi would say, quote, he will not escape justice and he will be held accountable for his despicable crimes, end quote. When asked about Mr. Trump's authorization for military force against the cartels, Anna Kelly, a White House spokeswoman, would say in an email that, quote, President Trump's top priority is protecting the homeland, which is why he took the bold step to designate several cartels and gangs as foreign terrorist organizations, end quote. And so yeah, that, my friends, brings us to right now, the time that I'm recording this. During night, it literally is about to be August 23rd, but it's, very late at night on August 22nd, 2025. Just this last month, President Trump would sign a still-secret directive that would instruct the Pentagon to use military force against some Latin American drug cartels that his administration had labeled as terrorist organizations. Around the same time this is occurring, the administration would declare that a Venezuelan criminal group was a terrorist organization and that Mr. Maduro was its leader, while calling his government illegitimate. Since then, the Pentagon began to move U.S. Navy assets, including warships, into the southern Caribbean Sea. In response, Mr. Maduro would announce on Monday of, this week, the 19th, that he was deploying 4.5 million militiamen around the country and vowed to defend our seas, our skies, and our lands from any incursions. As for what is actually happening then, the administration has said fairly little about its intentions. On Tuesday of this week, the White House press secretary, Karoline Leavitt, would be asked about the movements and whether the administration was considering putting forces on the ground, and she responded by calling Mr. Maduro illegitimate and invoking his indictment late in the first Trump administration on said drug trafficking charges. Mr. Trump, she said, is, quote, prepared to use every element of American power to stop drugs from flooding into our country and to bring those responsible to justice. The Maduro regime is not the legitimate government of Venezuela, it is a narco-terror cartel. End quote. Dear Lord, you can't get more explicit than that. That all being said, the Pentagon would decline to comment publicly about the specifics of the deployment. But Sean Parnell, the chief Pentagon spokesman, would say that cartels, quote, have engaged in historic violence and terror throughout our hemisphere and around the globe that has destabilized economies and internal security of countries, but also flooded the United States with deadly drugs, violent criminals, and vicious gangs, end quote. Which, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, that has happened. If you have not seen the video that I did on Mexico's cartels, you really should check that out as it explores this a bit more in detail, but there's so many other groups that we would be able to actually talk about. He would go on to add that the Defense Department would, quote, undoubtedly play an important role towards meeting the president's objectives to eliminate the ability of these cartels to threaten the territory, safety, and security of the United States and its people, end quote. And along with that, U.S. officials would say that up to 3 guided missile destroyers would soon arrive in the region. The naval warships would target boats operated by drug cartels transporting fentanyl to the United States, but they did not exactly explain how it is that they would do so. Also headed to the region is the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group, including the USS San Antonio, the USS Iwo Jima, and the USS Fort Lauderdale, carrying 4,500 sailors, and the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit with around 2,200 Marines, according to the Defense Department. Those ships and the Marines would depart from Norfolk, Virginia early in the week, but they had to turn around to avoid Hurricane Erin, but were then expected to head out soon afterwards to arrive in the next several days. Several P-8 surveillance planes and a submarine were also to be deployed to the region, according to officials. What we're describing here, the destroyers heading towards the zone outside of Venezuelan territorial waters, are the USS Jason Dunham and the USS Gravely, both warships that recently were in the campaign against the Houthi militia in the Red Sea, which is probably another video that, again, I'm going to need to do here soon. And a third destroyer, the USS Samson, now in the Eastern Pacific, would soon likely join them, according to another official. These warships are Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, equipped with more than 90 missiles, including surface-to-air missiles that can conduct anti-aircraft and anti-submarine warfare and shoot down ballistic missiles. These are major military assets, and deploying them against drug cartels would be like, as one defense official would, quote, say, bringing a howitzer to a knife fight, end quote. Which, yeah, that's pretty accurate. For context on this, the U.S. Navy has long intercepted and boarded ships that were suspected of smuggling drugs in international waters, typically with Coast Guard officers temporarily in charge to invoke law enforcement authority. But the scale of the forces the Pentagon is moving into place, coupled with the orders from Trump, suggests that the administration is contemplating actions that are significantly more than what has been done before with mere law enforcement. Do we know at this point what those actions are going to be? No, we don't. Not at the time that I'm making this, which I hope to God this is not horribly out of date by the time it goes out. The administration's intentions are being held secret, and it remains unclear what exact criteria or rules of engagement the administration is considering for any operations using armed force. Either way, my friends, that is where we are now. And I really do hate to leave you all here, but if things do really hit the fan, you can expect a follow-up video explaining how it happened. At the time, though, we're kind of out of information. That's just the entire story of how we got to here now. With that, I will go ahead and leave you. Thank you all very much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all here next time, my friends. Goodbye, and best of luck.